Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the third CKI podcast in our series on various issues affecting customs practitioners. Our previous two podcasts dealt with issues surrounding customs brokers. Today, we are taking a considerable change of direction, and we wish to talk about the operation of sanctions in Europe. Sanctions are now a matter of everyday life for many manufacturers in Europe, and there are some worrying signals arising in terms of the imposition of penalties and indeed the multiplication of bureaucratic controls around sanctions. Tony Buckley is my name. I am the chair of CKI. I'm joined this morning by Enrique Nhajoke, director of the Lithuanian Customs Practitioners Association, by Kevin Shakespeare, director of the Institute of Export and International Trade in the UK, and by Armin Belle, who is very welcome, a specialist consultant in export controls from Germany.
Thank you.
So this morning, I have drafted 3 questions to, as it were, begin the discussion. The first, I think, that we need to talk about briefly is how consistent is the application of controls across Europe when it comes to sanctions. There are some reports that some countries are more enthusiastic in their imposition of controls than others, and we'd just like to stock take on that point. Then there is the question of, compliance in customs is such a huge issue for everybody. The question arises, are sanctions and compliance with sanctions, is that a new and additional load or an extra load, or is it just an extension of normal compliance activity by the customs authorities? And thirdly, what is the situation and what advice can our experts give to companies who may find themselves in the position of accidental non-compliance? In other words, continuing as they always did and then finding that they have failed to comply with new regulations, new requirements around the imposition of sanctions. Can we give them any advice, any comfort in the situation in which they find themselves? Now, if I may, I would like to start with Enrique. You were telling us that the Lithuanian Customs Practitioners Association is active in this space, and of course, Lithuania is very much on the front line in all of this issue of sanctions. Would you like to begin, Enrique?
Yes, Tony, thank you. Lithuania is indeed in the front line because we have the borders with Russia and Belarus. And also a big alert came this year from European Commission. Lithuania ranked high as a country where possible circumvention of sanctions happens because the re-exports rose, numbers of re-exports rose. So national customs authorities decided to impose national measures, and they are quite extensive, and I can tell maybe a little bit later more about them. But coming back to your first question, which is about standardization, whether the rules apply same way in all the countries across the EU. And especially this question is important in the light of EU customs reform, where everybody heading towards standardization, but we have taken, I think, the wrong direction. What the national sanctions show, starting with the national list of sanctioned goods, which was released this year in June by Lithuanian authorities, we can see that differences are becoming bigger, and the law is not one international sanctions law in the EU, but the EU law plus 27 laws in national member states.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a matter of some concern. Armin, is that your experience also in Germany?
Yeah, thank you for asking. And in a way, I can really confirm what Enrica just told us. It's the same concern in Germany, specifically for smaller and medium-sized companies. And what we see in our legislation is that, first of all, we have a generally speaking, we have a differentiation in our point of view, or in our basic point of view, legal point of view, between legal entities and real private persons or personal persons. You and me, everybody.
Mm-hmm.
So
Natural
in the end,
persons, yes.
yeah, natural persons, exactly.
Yeah.
So the problem here is from a managing director's or from an officer's point of view, company officer's point of view, is that even if the company makes some general mistake, the managing director as a person is directly threatened by law, because in the end of the day, it's his responsibility as a managing director to take care of the internal organization and to make sure that all the sanctions and whatever export control is properly taken care of. So now that the enforcement from the EU, but also from US side, is becoming larger and larger, specifically given all the incidents happening lately from a global political perspective, that makes it more difficult, and it really raises a lot of concern.
Yes.
And also what these small company managing directors see is, at least they perceive personally that there is a difference among the countries how they are being treated. So a managing director in Germany is treated differently from his counterpart in France, in Netherlands, neighboring countries, you name it. So
yeah, absolutely.
That's my first statement.
Thanks, Armin. Kevin, in the UK, is there a feeling of victimization, as we've heard from Enrica and Armin?
I think it's important to note for UK businesses that just because the UK is no longer part of the European Union doesn't mean that the UK is not keen to ensure that there is compliance around export controls and sanctions, and the environment is still very much the case of one of enforcement. And the UK, I guess, is also in an interesting position because the UK is particularly strong in trade and services, software and consultancy, probably the second largest in the world after the US. So clearly software, unencrypted software, requires licenses, and businesses, just because the businesses don't physically trade across borders and through customs doesn't mean that licenses are not required. So I think UK businesses have to take account of that. And the other, I wouldn't say totally unique position, is the diaspora in the UK through the Commonwealth as well. There is a lot of trade through family businesses and contacts. Again, and it's important to note there that just because it's a member of family or relation doesn't mean that you don't need licenses for certain types of transactions. So enforcement is really key. And also the UK, Europe has close relations with America, but the UK has particularly close relations with the United States of America. So a lot for UK businesses to consider.
Yeah, in Ireland also the sanctions, again, many of the sanctioned goods and trades are controlled in Ireland by multinational companies, which are well geared and well prepared for the bureaucracy. Again, very close links with the United States, and of course the US export controls are well known to those larger companies. As with the UK, as you've described, Kevin, is the small and medium operators that are at risk, as it were, because the complexity of the regulations may elude the understanding of some of the smaller companies, particularly those in the software and allied industries. But it is of concern, I think, that that there is a feeling within Europe, particularly in the context of the EU customs reform proposals, that there is apparently evidence of a lack of standardization and a wish for different countries to impose the controls. Of course, some of this bears, I suppose, on the legal structure and the constitutional structure of the individual countries. That one of the agenda items for, I would say, the last 10 years or more in Europe that has failed to be progressed is standardizing penalties for non-compliance. And that largely goes to the constitutional structure of each of the member states and their legal systems, which make it very difficult to arrive at a single enforcement methodology. However, in this, what appears to be a time of heightening tensions, it's not very helpful to go forward. I suppose the next issue we need to think about is what we're talking about in the context of sanctions. Is this a new level of control by customs authorities? Does it represent almost a special compliance problem, or is it simply that standard compliance activity is now being applied to sanctions in the same way as it applies to everything else that customs practitioners are required to do? Would anybody like to comment on that? Yes, Enrique, thank you.
Yeah. I think it depends on the country, because Germany is very advanced in export controls and implementation of sanctions. It was, as exporting country, it always gave high relevance. Lithuania has been always transit country, so and we didn't pay that much attention. There was not so much talk, and the departments related to in the customs and other authorities to sanctions control were not so developed currently. What we see in our customs, there is a new department created with people dedicated to controls, sanction controls, and working with that. New laws are being passed. We never had special national laws regulating sanction controls. On the national level, as I mentioned, the list of sanctioned goods national was passed, and numerous requirements were also released for the goods to be allowed to be exported, re-exported, or even for the goods to be released in transit to the sanctioned countries, via the sanctioned countries, or to the countries that are at risk of circumvention. And there is even a list of countries that are included in that list. So all the goods going to Central Asia, South Caucasus, Moldova, Belarus, Turkey, and Serbia are strictly controlled, even when they go in transit. And the control is not about only Lithuania. Everybody in the supply chain is involved. Manufacturer, starting from the manufacturer to the final recipient of the goods. So everything is very new. We never had controls of such extension, so therefore it's a new area.
Yeah, I think it's a similar experience here in Ireland, where again the control of exports was largely it applied to the multinational companies that have manufacturing plants here, and so it was something of a niche concern. But now again, like Lithuania export control is now a major topic. And I assume it's similar in Germany, Armin.
Yeah, if I can, again, I can confirm what both of you said, what Enrica and you, Tony, just mentioned, is that from a German perspective, I mean, we are already in a situation that we are heavily, as how can I say, probably over-regulated country from a very general perspective. We have so many rules for everything. So the German companies are really really stuck heavily in all the administrative rules. But I want to point out one more direction that that the administrative side is taking. And I just participated 2 weeks ago in a combined BAFA and BIS, Bureau of Industry and Security forum here in Germany, and it's very clear that they are that the focus first of all on technologies. In the recent history, they were always talking about emerging technologies for the last 3 years or so, but now they just talk about technologies, very general. Wow. So, and that makes it even more dangerous for companies if they are not aware of that.
Yes.
And the second aspect I want to make you all aware of is that there is a lot of focus on financial transactions, even indirectly. So if some company, and that's also important in what Enrica said about her country, in countries that only make transfer of goods mostly, but if the companies involve, for example, US banks in the financial transaction, then all of a sudden they are up to US export control, and they are not aware of it, not at all, not even here in Germany. They are so the.
I would say that
we should really raise awareness for that.
Awareness is very widespread, Armin, because the connections of banks, as we know,
exactly,
very involved and complex. And yes, thank you for that. That's yes, the scope and the impact of the sanctions is widening all the time, and that must be a big issue as well in the UK, where, after all, financing and the role of the City of London in so many transactions around the world must be a concern.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a couple of aspects also picking up from what Armin just said is the banking community. I think it's fair to say in the UK that the banks are probably amongst the most heavily regulated in the world because of the connections with the United States, and the number of the UK banks have been subject to quite severe fines and penalties in the last few years. So for UK businesses, they have the oversight of the government, but they have the oversight of the banks that all have to have the OFAC software embedded in their system. So it is fair to say, I think the UK banks generally have a very big compliance team. And I think post the financial crisis, the compliance team of banks tended to run the bank effectively, certainly in the UK, so and probably elsewhere. So again, I think businesses need to be aware of their banks are monitoring them, and they will have risk ratings against certain types of businesses depending on their profile and the countries and the sectors. And we do have examples where some businesses have sort of considered over the years trading in sterling, not trading in US dollars, but that is clearly a breach of sanctions if you're trying to circumvent it and just avoid trading in US dollars. The other thing I think interesting is the professional services and business services consultancy firms in the UK, and I'm sure it's the same in the EU, but the UK, I think, was the first country was to impose sanctions against consultancy firms as well. And some of our big consultancy firms have had to divest and close their operations in Russia, for example. So it's there. But coming back to the point, I think, of businesses, some businesses, clearly the larger businesses, have maybe had global trade compliance departments which would cover customs, trade, exports. But it's interesting, I think, and it's a valid point, that smaller businesses now are having to include sanctions and export controls in their compliance functions, which is a relatively new area for smaller businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, I think it is. And the comments about the attempt to make sure that sanctions are reflected in every part of the supply chain does raise risks, doesn't it? In the sense that if you are a supplier or a manufacturer, you must be aware of where it is you're obtaining your components and your inputs from, and also be aware of the uses to which the person you supply may put the goods. So it's imposing controls all along the way. One of the things that occurs to me is that because of the rapidity with which all of these new rules have been imposed, I mean, it's been a deluge of controls in the last 18 months or so. This has not been legally tested. And I have the feeling that a lot of the sanctions imposition, a lot of the fines and so on, while they are justified by regulation, of course, in the individual countries, there's a very strong political air about them. And I wonder in the longer term, the possibility of legal challenges there. And I'm wondering, is there perhaps, as Enrica has described in Lithuania, in some countries, a very pardonable excessive zeal on the part of the authorities in enforcing sanctions rules, which maybe in a couple of years' time might be seen to be poorly grounded in law. That because some of the actions taken seem to have, or some of the penalties imposed, they seem to make no allowance for innocent error or for lack of information or for the fact that people just didn't know that they were playing a part. There's an assumption almost of intent in many of the regulations. And I wonder to what degree that will stand up to thorough legal scrutiny when time permits that thorough legal scrutiny to be carried out. Because as I say, at the moment, with many of these regulations, they're so new, they simply haven't been fully tested in the courts. Any views on that? Yes, Enrica.
Okay. Okay.
Armin, perhaps.
Okay. Yes, I just went through an official, not an internal, an official audit, customs audit with one of my customers, and it's an international trading company, and for them it's even worse. The manufacturers, they basically they have a pretty good knowledge about their own product and the HS codes and the implications on the export control side. But for a trading company, they are faced with all kinds of different orders every day.
Yeah.
So one time it's about inverters, the next time it's about servo drives, the next order is about valves and God knows what.
Yes.
And so that makes it extremely complicated also from a control aspect. And but the authorities, they don't care.
Yeah.
They just see the company, and whatever happens, they put on the list, and you get fined for it, even as a managing director in the end of the day.
Yes.
So and this is a major concern, and not just here in Germany, but also for trading companies all over Europe, because so far they haven't been really on the scope of official legislation. But now the rules are changing, and more pressure is coming on those companies. Because the Russians, for example, just an example, they really they try to bypass in all kinds of ways.
Yes, of course.
The official sanctions. And so trading is really in the focus.
Absolutely. Sorry, Enrique, you wanted to come in there.
Sorry.
Exactly. I will continue then from Armin. Armin says trading is in focus, and we also see that the rules are new and new for both sides, for the traders and other parties involved, and also for the customs. Lithuanian customs provides useful statistics annually and on occasion.
Yes.
So in September, they informed that due to non-compliance with sanctions, only this year, 18,245 trucks were not allowed out of the EU through Lithuanian borders. What does it mean? Does it mean that either they went to other EU countries and went out through there, or there can be other implications as well? For example, it's also important aspect to consider that customs, at least in Lithuania, they have the right to decide how serious is the infringement and to seize the goods, to confiscate them. So we had court cases where the court said, yes, customs was right and we will not interfere. So it was correct to seize the goods. This is one implication. And other implication, we have already court cases where companies said customs was not right not to release the goods out of the EU, and courts said yes, customs was not right. So the rules are not clear, they are new, and some goods are just, so it's an additional risk for business. So you can comply, but misunderstanding can come in also from the customs side.
Okay, so it is really a new imposition, not just in the context of new regulations, but also in the context of a heightened awareness on the part of the customs authorities and a more dedicated enforcement. I think that's true in the UK and in Ireland as well, Kevin, isn't it?
Absolutely, yes. I think since March 2020, I think statistics were going forward 3 years to about March, April this year. 43 fines were issued, an average of £175,000 per business. And that's some of those just from dual use, without businesses understand the importance of end use and end user, which I think, as has been indicated today, is really, really important to actually understand it. But I think there's also mentioned as a concept of transport companies, the likes of the freight forwarders and shipping lines have to be aware as well. And again, I think with the UK, it also applies for the EUs. We have some very big commodity trading houses, the London Metal and Minerals Exchange. And some of those big commodity houses also have to be very, very careful as well. You know, they would generally have good controls and be aware of procedures. But again, the flows there become really, really important. But yeah, very true as in the UK, Ireland and the European Union is the importance of sanctions compliance. And a few years ago, we had some of our larger companies clearly selling to Saudi Arabia. There's good trade between the UK and Saudi. And there was a time period in which approved licenses were held whilst there was a review of actually where those goods were going in terms of end use.
I think it's fair to say, though, that generally speaking, authorities and indeed the European Commission are concerned about the overall effectiveness of sanctions. So they tend to focus in terms of serious investigations and in-depth investigations. They tend to focus on larger flows or established flows of goods rather than an occasional package, you know. And so from the point of view of small and medium companies, we wouldn't want to create too much fear out there about the sanctions. That the type of extreme sanctions, as Armin has outlined, where a managing director could be, and indeed other officers of the company could be held personally liable and lose personal assets and perhaps even face imprisonment. That is unlikely to happen if there is a single error which is not repeated. On the other hand, if there is evidence of a scheme to circumvent the sanctions. That is, I think, where the heavy guns are brought out, as it were, and where really serious sanctions will be imposed. But from perhaps if we could focus for just to conclude on the small and medium enterprise, perhaps on the customs broker who may not have very much experience in this field and so on the avoidance of error, that you, as Kevin has mentioned, perhaps you have a contract or a purchase order for goods which may be dual use. I suppose the question is, how do you make sure that it's safe to make that sale? What do you check? What do you look at? Because, as I say, an error will result in punishment. Not maybe they won't necessarily take your house for one error, but at the same time, it's something that companies do not want to acquire the reputation with their customs authorities of being loose in implementing the rules. So could we get some comments on just how to assess sales prospects in the context of sanctions? Yes, Enrique. Thank you.
As former customs broker, I will take on this point. So the customs brokers, they receive already penalties here in Lithuania, and we have national law, again, administrative offenses law, and the penalties for sanctions infringement can reach from 100 euros to 6,000 euros. 6,000 is the maximum amount. What I've heard, currently the first fines are 100 to 100 euros in this area for some not so serious infringements, of course. How to check the compliance with sanctions for not to make a mistake, I think it became a kind of easier. Why? Because of the national requirements, because they require so much information, also the customs broker to gather, and I will provide some details on that. But what I want to say, what becomes even more complex for customs brokers, because previously they have focused on customs declaration, to submit customs declaration, and that goods successfully go through customs. This was the main aim. Now they are really starting to, they are really feel to be a part of the whole supply chain, because they are obliged to take care to receive confirmations from the manufacturer, whom they might not know and who can be somewhere in the supply chain, and also from the recipient of the goods in the third country, Kazakhstan or somewhere. So they care, they think, and they go deep into information, and this way they prove the compliance. And I wanted just to cite a little bit the new law in Lithuania, which was passed in June this year. So if the goods transit through Lithuania to the countries I mentioned previously in Central Asia and others, we, the customs brokers, should take care to prove to customs that the goods were either purchased in Lithuania or were packed here. This is a very interesting moment, because the UCC is in place for so many years, and the UCC Implementing Act, one provision says that the goods must be packed or loaded in the country where they are exported and declared to the customs, which controls that place. In Lithuania, we haven't applied this provision, and everybody could do exports, re-exports in Lithuania from other EU member states. Now, this provision since June is strictly complied with, and customs requires, as I mentioned, invoice for packing the goods, or if it is not available, then a document issued by the manufacturer of the exported goods. And this document is required also in other cases when sanctioned goods, they go not to Russia or Belarus, but they go to those other countries. And in this manufacturer's declaration, manufacturer has to state that he or she knows the buyer and the seller of the goods, that they are aware that the goods, if they transit through Russia or Belarus, that they transit through Belarus, and they are certain that there will be no manipulations on the way, that they are aware of end use of the goods, and also that they are certain and can assure that there will be no sanctions infringements. So an extensive document from manufacturer
So
and
basically, unless the sales contract is worth a lot of money, you don't make the sale. I take it from what you're saying.
Exactly.
It's
And
just the cost of compliance would be enormous.
exactly. But this document must be in hands of customs broker. And another document that I would mention, customs broker in Lithuania is obliged in the course of 40 days after exportation or release of goods going out of Lithuania to present an import declaration or equivalent document, a copy certified by customs authorities in the third country that it is original to our customs. So
what you've described, though, Enrica, raises a real question for individual member states, because if some member states are imposing those kind of rules, as Lithuania is, and others are not, inevitably trade will go towards those countries where the cost of compliance is lower. Is that a fair comment, Kevin, do you think?
It is, and I think obviously one of the risks of sanctions and export controls is trade diversion, and this is potentially another example of it. And I know Enrica's mentioned Central Asia, and I guess that is a region that has been called out. But absolutely, there is that risk of trade diversion. So standardization becomes really important.
Absolutely. Armin, would you like, I'm afraid we're running out of time, so perhaps, Armin, you might close our discussion for us with a final comment?
Just a final comment. If I'm asked, I'm very much involved in our engineering associations in Germany. And when I'm asked about the company members of those associations, what I would recommend personally, I always tell them for medium-sized and larger companies, I strongly recommend of implementing an ICP program, an internal compliance program, which the larger companies very often they already have. And for the smaller ones, specifically the smaller manufacturers, I highly recommend teaming up with a trading house or an exporter who really knows what they are doing, who in turn themselves have an internal ICP.
Yes.
And then everything is okay.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a very good note on which to end. That sanctions, clearly, it's an evolving story which we may return to in the future in our discussions here. But the advice from Armin, I think, is very well made, which is for small and medium companies, if you cannot afford your own internal compliance program, then do business through or with a larger entity that is aware of the compliance and can manage it on your behalf. Shall we leave it there for today? And thank you all very, very much for a fascinating insight into the operation of sanctions at the moment. Thank you.